They say trust in a marriage is like a house perched on a cliff by the ocean. One small crack, and the waves come crashing in, taking everything with them. I thought our house was solid. I was wrong. Lena and I had been together for 7 years. To everyone else, we were the golden couple, perfect, untouchable. And Lena? She wasn't just beautiful. She was magnetic. Her thick, dark hair seemed to catch the light just right. Her sharp green eyes could stop anyone in their tracks, and her laugh, it wasn't just a sound, it was a command for attention. She was the kind of woman who owned every room she walked into, and she knew it. But behind closed doors, Lena was complicated. She lived in extremes. One day, she'd kiss me like I was the only man in the world. The next, she'd be distant, scrolling through her phone with an expression I couldn't read. I told myself that's just who she was. Intense, passionate, a little restless. The first red flag was easy to dismiss. She started coming home later than usual, blaming late nights at the office. "New project," she said. "Tight deadlines." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But then came the second one. Her phone. She used to leave it around without a second thought. But suddenly it was always with her. Even in the bathroom. She'd clutch it like it held nuclear codes. And when it buzzed, she'd glance at it with this flicker of something. Anxiety? Guilt? I wasn't sure. I started noticing smaller things too. Changes you don't expect in a marriage. New perfumes that weren't her usual scent. Lingerie that I'd never seen before but never saw her wear for me. "You're imagining things," I muttered to myself more times than I could count. It was easier to think I was paranoid than to believe that the woman I loved could be lying to me. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Friday, and she was late again. 2 hours late. I sat on the couch, flipping through TV channels. I wasn't really watching, my leg bouncing with nervous energy. I tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. 30 minutes passed. An hour. Finally, I heard the car pull into the driveway. The front door opened and Lena stepped inside. She froze when she saw me sitting there like a kid caught sneaking in after curfew. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. Her face flushed. "I told you. I had to stay late at work. You said that yesterday. And the day before that." She sighed, annoyed. "It's a busy week. What do you want me to say?" "The truth," I said. She rolled her eyes and dropped her bag on the table. "Jesus, not this again." "Lena," I stood up, stepping closer. "Just tell me, is there someone else?" Her eyes darted away from mine, and my stomach twisted into a knot. There it was, proof in her silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words. I felt like the floor had cracked beneath my feet. I forced myself to stay calm. "When?" I whispered. She still wouldn't look at me. "How long, Lena?" A tear slipped down her cheek, and she finally whispered, 6 months. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. 6 months. Half a year of lying, sneaking around, pretending. I took a shaky breath. "Who is he?" Her jaw clenched. "It doesn't matter." "The hell it doesn't," I spat. "I deserve to, and no." She finally looked at me, and for the first time, there wasn't just guilt in her eyes. There was defiance. "His name is Ryan." Ryan. A guy from her office. I remembered meeting him at one of her company parties. A tall, blonde guy, with a fake smile and a handshake that lasted too long. My blood went cold. I felt my fists clench at my sides. The rage burned hot, but underneath it was something worse. Grief. The death of everything I thought we had. She stared at me like she was waiting for me to scream or hit something. But I didn't. I just stared back, numb. "I'm done," I said finally, my voice flat and lifeless. She blinked, confused. "What?" "You heard me." I walked past her and grabbed my keys. "I'm done, Lena." I didn't wait for her to respond. I opened the door, stepped outside, and let the cold night air fill my lungs. The night was eerily quiet. My marriage was over, and I felt like I'd walked away from a war zone. I wasn't sure where I was driving. I just needed to get out, to breathe, to think. But as I drove down the familiar streets, I found myself turning toward a house I hadn't been to in years, a house that belonged to someone who always understood me better than Lena ever did. Her sister, Alice. I pulled up to Alice's house before I even realized where I was going. The headlights illuminated her front steps, casting long shadows across the porch. I sat there for a second, hands still gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding me together. Alice was Lena's twin, but if you stood them side by side, you'd notice the differences right away. Lena was sharp and intense, always dressed like she was ready for a magazine cover. Alice was softer, freckles on her cheeks, hair usually, in a messy braid, and an old band t-shirt most of the time. Where Lena walked into a room and demanded attention, Alice felt like a warm hug after a cold day. I hadn't spoken to her in years. Not really. Not since Lena started pulling me away from anyone who could see through her. But in that moment, when my whole life felt like it was imploding, Alice's place felt like the only safe harbor left. I killed the engine and stepped out into the cold night air. My breath fogged in front of me as I climbed the steps and knocked. There was a long pause before the door opened. Alice stood there, barefoot, wearing plaid pajama pants and a sweatshirt that hung off one shoulder. She blinked at me, confused. "Nate," she said, her voice soft but surprised. What are you doing here?" I felt the weight of everything I'd been holding in rush to the surface. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Alice's expression shifted from confused to worried. "Jesus," she whispered. "Come in." I stepped inside, and the warmth of her house wrapped around me like a blanket. It smelled like vanilla and old books. She led me to the couch and sat down next to me, pulling a throw blanket off the back and draping it over my shoulders, before I could protest. Her kindness broke me. I don't know how long I sat there before the words finally came out. "She cheated on me." Alice's face froze. Her eyes locked onto mine like she was trying to make sense of the words. "Lena?" I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. Her hands flew to her mouth, and she stared at me like I'd just told her the world was ending. Then, slowly, she lowered her hands and whispered, "How long?" "6 months," I said bitterly. Her jaw tightened. That bitch." It was the first time I'd ever heard Alice use that word. She was always the calm one, the peacekeeper. But in that moment I saw something else in her eyes, something fierce. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, trying to find words for the chaos in my head. "I don't even know who she is anymore, or maybe I never did." Alice reached out and put her hand on my arm. Just a small touch, but it anchored me. "You're not crazy, Nate," she said softly. Lena's always had a darkness in her. I've seen it my whole life." I turned to her, surprised. "Why didn't you tell me?" Alice's face twisted with regret. "Would you have believed me? You were so in love with her. I didn't want to ruin that for you." I wanted to argue, to say that I would have listened, but deep down I knew she was right. I'd built Lena up into something untouchable, convinced myself she was flawless even when the cracks were staring me in the face. Alice stood up suddenly. "Do you want some tea, coffee, whiskey?" "Whiskey?" I said without hesitation. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. I heard cabinets opening and the clink of glasses. When she came back, she handed me a glass of amber liquid and sat down close enough that our shoulders almost touched. We drank in silence for a while. The warmth of the whiskey settled in my chest, dulling the sharp edges of the pain. Finally, Alice spoke. "There's something you should know." I looked over at her. Her face was pale, and she was fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "What?" I asked, dread curling in my stomach. She hesitated, then said, "I've known about the affair for a while." The words hit me like a punch. "What?" I didn't know what to do, Nate. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how without making everything worse. "Worse?" I barked out a bitter laugh. "How could it be worse than this?" Her eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand. Lena, she made me promise not to tell you." My stomach dropped. "Wait, you and Lena, you've talked about this?" Alice looked away. "She came to me months ago, when it started. She told me she felt trapped. She said you didn't understand her anymore. I felt like I'd been slapped. She used you, I said, my voice low. She made you feel like you had to protect her. Alice nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Nate. I stared at her, torn between anger and something else, something softer. It wasn't her fault. She wasn't the one who lied to me, cheated, destroyed our life. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been complicit, even if unintentionally. You're the only one who's ever really been honest with me, I said finally. Alice blinked in surprise. After everything? I nodded. Yeah, after everything. The air between us felt heavier, but not in a bad way. More like the dust settling after an earthquake. Alice wiped her eyes and gave me a weak smile. You deserve better than this, Nate. I swallowed hard. You've always been better, Alice. The words hung between us, charged with something unspoken. She stared at me, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't let myself notice before. A quiet kind of love. And just like that, everything shifted. The lines I'd drawn between us for years blurred. I reached for her hand without thinking, and when her fingers intertwined with mine, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. For a second, I thought she might pull away, but she didn't. Alice leaned in, her face inches from mine. Are you sure about this? She whispered. I wasn't sure of anything anymore, except that in that moment, with her, I didn't feel broken. I felt alive. Yes, I said. And then I kissed her. The moment our lips met, it felt like stepping off a ledge, and for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of the fall. Alice's kiss was everything Lena's never was. Warm, steady, real. There was no game, no power struggle, just two people breaking apart and piecing themselves back together, but it wasn't just passion, it was dangerous. In the back of my mind, a voice whispered, You're kissing your wife's sister. Alice pulled back slightly, her forehead resting against mine. We were both breathing hard. Nate, she whispered, her eyes searching mine for something. Doubt, maybe. Regret. But I didn't feel any of that. Not right then. Alice, I said, barely above a whisper, we don't have to. She shook her head. No, I've waited too long. My stomach twisted at the vulnerability in her voice. I wanted to ask what she meant. How long had she felt this way? But part of me already knew. There had always been this quiet tension between us, something neither of us dared to acknowledge. And now that it was out in the open, there was no putting it back. I leaned in again, my hand brushing against her cheek. Her skin was soft and warm, and for the first time that night, I let myself forget about Lena, her lies, her betrayal, the way she'd made me feel small. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, tangled in silence and whispers. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, and I fell asleep with Alice's head resting against my shoulder. When I woke up, it was early morning. Pale sunlight filtered through the windows. For a brief second, I forgot where I was. And then I saw Alice, curled up beside me, her face peaceful in sleep. Reality hit me like a freight train. What the hell have I done? I slid off the couch as quietly as I could, careful not to wake her. My head was pounding, not from the whiskey, but from everything that had happened. The betrayal, the anger, the kiss. I needed air. I grabbed my jacket and slipped outside. The morning chill bit at my skin as I paced down the street, trying to sort through the storm of emotions in my head. But before I could make sense of any of it, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up behind me. I turned just in time to see Lena's sleek black sedan stop at the curb. My heart slammed in my chest. She stepped out, her hair perfect. Despite the early hour, her expression unreadable behind a pair of dark sunglasses. Nate, she said, her voice calm in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. What are you doing here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She took off the sunglasses, revealing bloodshot eyes. It was the first time I'd ever seen her look fragile. I need to talk to you. I shook my head. There's nothing left to talk about, Lena. Yes, there is, she said, stepping closer. Please. I wanted to tell her to leave, to turn my back and walk away, but something in her voice stopped me. I didn't trust it, but I couldn't ignore it either. I folded my arms. Fine, talk. Lena's eyes darted toward Alice's house, then back to me. Not here, she said. Please. I hesitated, but eventually nodded. We walked a few blocks to a small park nearby, the kind with old benches and a fountain that hadn't worked in years. We sat in silence for a minute, the tension between us thick enough to choke on. Lena finally broke the silence. I screwed up, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know that. I stared straight ahead, watching the dead leaves float across the grass. That's an understatement. She took a shaky breath. I never meant for it to get this far. I laughed bitterly. Funny how that happens when you're sneaking around for 6 months. Lena flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to me without a word. What is this? I asked, suspicious. Just read it. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was handwritten, and the second I saw the name at the top, my blood ran cold. Ryan. I scanned the note, my pulse quickening with every word. It wasn't a love letter. It was a confession. Lena, it's over. I can't do this anymore. You need to tell him the truth, or I will. My hands shook as I read the last line. Ryan had ended it. I looked up at Lena, my mind spinning. He broke it off. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. A month ago. That's why you came back, I said, the realization hitting me like a sledgehammer. Not because you love me, because he dumped you. No, Lena's voice cracked. That's not true. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Don't, I snapped. Don't you dare. Lena's tears spilled over. I was stupid, Nate, I know that. But I'm trying to fix this. I stood up, rage boiling under my skin. You don't get to fix this, Lena. You don't get to waltz back into my life like nothing happened. She stood too, her face desperate. But I'm your wife. We've built a life together. I stared at her, my voice low and cold. You burned that life to the ground. Her eyes flickered with something dangerous. She took a step closer, her voice dropping. Do you really think Alice will be any different? Do you really believe she's innocent? The accusation blindsided me. What the hell are you talking about? Lena's lips curled into a bitter smile. She's always wanted you, Nate. She was never just the supportive sister. Don't fool yourself. I froze, her words sinking in like poison. Part of me wanted to believe she was lying, another desperate attempt to control me. But the seed of doubt was already planted. Lena saw it in my face and pressed harder. You think she's so perfect? She's been waiting for this moment for years, and now she has you exactly where she wants you. I clenched my fists, trying to push her voice out of my head, but the damage was done. Lena stepped back, her face twisted with something between triumph and regret. You're not just breaking ties with me, Nate. You're stepping into something worse. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the cold morning light, my mind a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and betrayal. I didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was clear. I was trapped between two sisters, and this war was far from over. I stood there in that empty park long after Lena left, the crumpled letter still clenched in my fist. Her words replayed in my mind like a bad song on repeat. She's always wanted you. She has you exactly where she wants you. Was Lena just trying to poison me against Alice? Or had there always been something beneath the surface, something I'd been too blind to see? The morning chill finally seeped into my bones, and I forced myself to move. I walked back toward Alice's house, trying to shake off the doubts Lena had planted in my mind. But when I saw Alice standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, worry written all over her face, I felt a sharp pang of guilt. She wasn't like Lena. She couldn't be. Alice stepped toward me, searching my face. Where did you go? I hesitated, unsure of what to say. Lena showed up. Alice's eyes widened. What? She wanted to talk, I muttered, brushing past her into the house. The warmth felt suffocating now. Alice closed the door behind me, her voice tight. What did she say? I turned to face her, running a hand through my hair. She said Ryan broke it off with her a month ago. That's why she came back. Alice crossed her arms, anger flashing in her eyes. Of course. Typical Lena. She never comes back because she's sorry. Only because she lost something she wanted. I nodded, but then I hesitated, the doubt creeping back in. She said you've always wanted me. Alice froze. Her eyes searched mine, but I couldn't read her expression. My voice dropped. Is it true? She let out a bitter laugh and shook her head. God, Nate, is that really what you're asking me right now? I need to know, I said quietly. After everything, I don't know what's real anymore. Alice's shoulders slumped, and she sank onto the couch. Yes, it's true. My heart skipped a beat. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with both shame and something deeper. I've loved you for as long as I can remember. And yeah, maybe that makes me a terrible person. I've spent years pretending I didn't feel anything, trying to be the good sister. But every time Lena hurt you, every time she made you feel small, Her voice broke, and she wiped her eyes. I wanted to be the one to make it right. I stared at her, speechless. I know how it sounds, she continued, but I didn't want this to happen like this. I didn't want to be some consolation prize after Lena destroyed everything. Her words hit me like a gut punch. She wasn't wrong. I had kissed her out of pain and anger, out of the need to feel something other than betrayal. But as I looked at her, I realized that what I felt for Alice wasn't just some fleeting reaction. It had been there all along, buried beneath layers of denial and loyalty to Lena. I sat down next to her, my hands trembling. You're not a consolation prize, Alice. She shook her head. How can you say that? Last night? It wasn't real. It was real to me, I said firmly. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt safe. Alice's lip quivered, but she didn't look away. So what now? Lena's not going to let this go, Nate. You know that. She'll burn everything to the ground before she lets either of us move on. I sighed, leaning back against the couch. I don't care what she does anymore. Alice tilted her head. You should. There was a weight to her words that made my skin crawl. What do you mean? I asked cautiously. Alice hesitated, then whispered, You don't know the full story. A cold shiver ran down my spine. What story? She took a deep breath, like she was bracing herself for something terrible. Ryan didn't break things off with Lena because he had a change of heart. He broke it off because Lena threatened him. My stomach dropped. What? Alice's voice wavered. She found out about his wife, about their kids. She told him if he didn't end things, she'd ruin his life. She wasn't some heartbroken mistress, Nate. She was in control the whole time. I stared at her, struggling to process what she was telling me. Lena wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. She's not going to stop, Nate, Alice whispered. If she can't have you, she'll make sure no one else can either. The room seemed to close in around me. My mind flashed back to the way Lena had looked this morning, calm, composed, but with that underlying edge of something darker. Alice reached for my hand. You need to stay away from her. Promise me. I nodded, but the truth was, I wasn't sure how to stop someone like Lena. She'd always been 2 steps ahead, always knew exactly where to twist the knife. Just then, my phone buzzed on the table. I picked it up and felt my heart skip a beat when I saw the notification. Unknown number. We're not done, Nate. Alice saw my face pale and leaned over. What is it? I showed her the message, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. She's already starting, I said, my voice hollow. Alice's eyes darkened. Then we need to finish it. There was a finality in her voice that sent chills down my spine. Whatever this was, whatever game Lena thought she was playing, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about survival. Alice wasn't just a bystander anymore, and neither was I. Alice's words echoed in my head. We need to finish it. I wasn't sure what finish it even meant. My life had turned into something out of a thriller movie. The betrayal, the lies, and now this dark undercurrent of something even more dangerous. Lena wasn't just bitter. She was spiraling, and we were standing in the path of whatever storm she was brewing. Alice and I sat in tense silence, the weight of the message hanging between us like a curse. "We're not done, Nate." My phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. "If you thought last night was a mistake, you can still come home, but if you keep this up, you'll lose everything." Alice read it over my shoulder and let out a short, humorless laugh. "She still thinks she owns you." I stared at the screen, anger boiling under my skin. The audacity of it, the sheer manipulation in those words. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She was playing a power game. Alice leaned closer, her voice low. "We can't let her control the narrative." I exhaled slowly. "Then what do we do? Block her number and hope she gets bored?" Alice's jaw tightened. "No. We make it clear that she can't scare you. No more hiding." I glanced at her, searching for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Alice wasn't afraid. She was done with Lena's games, and maybe I needed to be too. "I need to see Ryan," I muttered. Alice blinked. "Ryan? Why?" "If she really threatened him, I need to hear it from him." Alice hesitated. "Do you think he'll talk to you?" I stood up and grabbed my keys. There's only one way to find out. Ryan's house was in one of those cookie-cutter suburban neighborhoods where every lawn was perfectly mowed and every house looked the same. But when I pulled up, his driveway was empty and the blinds were drawn tight. The whole place felt lifeless. I walked up the steps and rang the doorbell. No answer. I rang it again, then knocked. Nothing. I turned to leave when I heard the door creak open behind me. I spun around and came face to face with Ryan's wife. I'd only met her once at a company event. She was petite, with soft blonde hair and tired eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wary. I cleared my throat. "Is Ryan home?" Her face twisted into something bitter. "No." There was a pause, thick with tension. "I'm sorry," I said awkwardly. I need to talk to him." Her eyes darkened. "You and me both." Something in her tone sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated. "Is everything okay?" She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You really don't know, do you?" I shook my head. She stepped outside, crossing her arms against the cold. "Ryan's gone. Packed his things and left 2 days. Ego, no note, no explanation." My blood ran cold. "Gone?" She nodded. "I woke up and he was just gone." It felt like the ground shifted beneath me. 2 days ago, right after Lena's confrontation. "I think she scared him off," his wife continued, her voice shaking with barely concealed rage. "Whoever she is." I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Her eyes narrowed. "If you find him, tell him he can stay gone." She turned on her heel and slammed the door shut behind her. I stood there for a long moment, processing what she'd said. Ryan hadn't just broken things off with Lena, he'd run. He was gone, and Lena was still here, still pulling strings, still watching. When I got back to Alice's, she was waiting by the window, her arms crossed. When she saw me pull in, she rushed to the door. "What happened?" she asked the second I stepped inside. "He's gone," I said flatly, her brow furrowed. "Gone?" I nodded. "Left without a word. His wife has no idea where he is." Alice let out a slow breath. "Damn." I sank onto the couch, running my hands through my hair. "Lena scared him off. She's capable of anything." Alice sat next to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We have to be careful." I turned to her. "Alice, what if she's not bluffing? What if she really tries to ruin everything? You know how she operates. She's already unraveling." Alice's face hardened. "Then we don't give her the chance." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Alice leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine. We need to tell people the truth about what she did, about everything. We take her power away. I shook my head. She'll twist it. She'll make herself look like the victim. Alice's lips pressed into a thin line. Not if we get ahead of her. The idea sent a rush of adrenaline through me. Could we really do it? Could we flip the narrative before Lena had the chance to destroy us both? Just as I was about to respond, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a text. It was a picture. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. The image was grainy, taken through a window, but it was unmistakable. It was Alice and me, sitting together on the couch, her hand on my shoulder. The message below it read, "Everyone will know soon." Alice leaned over, her face going pale when she saw the photo. "She's watching us," I whispered, a chill running down my spine. Alice stood up, pacing the room. "She's escalating," I nodded. "We need to act fast." Alice's eyes met mine, fierce and determined. "Then let's end this, once and for all." Alice's words hung in the air like a dare. "Let's end this." I stared at the photo on my phone, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was Lena's signature, quiet, ruthless intimidation. She wasn't just watching. She wanted us to feel trapped, powerless. But for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt angry. Alice paced the room, her movements sharp and restless. "She's always one step ahead," she muttered. "She knows exactly how to push us." "She's not ahead anymore," I said quietly. Alice stopped and turned to me, confused. I stood up, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "If she wants to blow up our lives, fine. But she's not the only one who can play dirty." Alice's eyes narrowed. "What are you thinking?" I held up my phone, the image still on the screen. "She's so confident that no one will ever see who she really is. Maybe it's time we showed the world." Alice crossed her arms. "You're saying, go public?" I nodded. "Not just with her affair, with everything. Ryan, the threats, all of it." Alice's face hardened. "That could work. But it could also backfire. If we screw this up, she'll make herself look like the victim." "She's been controlling the story this whole time," I said. "But people like Lena, they can't stand the truth. If we expose her first, she won't have time to spin it." Alice hesitated, biting her lip. "There's one problem. We don't have Ryan. Without him, it's our word against hers." "Then we don't wait for Ryan," I said. "We use what we have. Every message, every voicemail, everything." Alice sat down slowly, staring at the floor. I could see the fear in her eyes, fear of what Lena was capable of. But then she looked up at me, and the fear was replaced by something else. Resolve. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." The plan came together faster than I expected. We drafted a post, long, raw, and honest. We laid everything bare. Lena's affair, her threats to Ryan, the messages she'd sent me, even the photos she'd taken of Alice and me. Alice hesitated when we got to the part about us. "Are you sure?" she asked. I reached for her hand. "I'm sure." She nodded, and together we hit post. The response was instant. Their own experiences with Lena. Old classmates, former co-workers, people who'd seen through her mask long before I had. She did the same thing to me. She's always been a liar. I always knew there was something off about her. By the time an hour had passed, Lena's perfect image was crumbling. Alice sat beside me, scrolling through the comments. "Do you think she's seen it yet?" As if on cue, my phone rang. Lena. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Alice's voice was steady. "Answer it." I took a deep breath and hit accept. "Lena," I said, my voice calm. There was silence on the other end for a long moment. And then, "What the hell have you done?" I could hear the fury barely contained in her voice, like a volcano ready to erupt. "The truth," I said simply. "That's what I've done." She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You think this makes you the hero? You're pathetic, Nate. You're trying to ruin me because you couldn't handle the truth." I clenched my jaw. "No, Lena. I'm not ruining you. You did that to yourself." Her breathing was ragged now. Do you have any idea what you've just started? I know exactly what I've started, I said. You can't control people anymore. You can't scare me, and you sure as hell can't scare Alice. At the mention of Alice, Lena's tone darkened. She's not innocent. You think she's better than me? She's not. I felt Alice's hand on my arm grounding me. You don't get to twist this, I said coldly. This isn't about Alice, it's about you. There was another long silence. When Lena spoke again, her voice was low, almost hollow. You'll regret this, Nate. Maybe, I said, but not as much as you will. I ended the call and set the phone down. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in months, I felt free. Alice looked at me, concern etched on her face. What did she say? I shrugged. She threatened me. Alice's lips pressed into a thin line. She always does. The next few days were chaos. The fallout from our post rippled across every corner of our lives. Some people reached out with support. Others chose sides. Lena's reputation took a hit she couldn't recover from. She tried to post her own version of events, but it came off desperate. Too little, too late. Ryan's wife reached out to me privately. She'd seen the post and confirmed everything. You were right, she wrote. She scared him into leaving. That message was the final nail in Lena's coffin. But not everything went smoothly. There were moments when I questioned if I'd done the right thing, when the guilt and exhaustion hit harder than the relief. But every time I started to doubt, Alice was there, steady and unwavering. One morning, a week after everything had come crashing down, Alice and I sat together on the porch, drinking coffee in the early light. You okay? She asked, her voice soft. I nodded, staring out at the quiet street. Yeah. For the first time in a long time, I think I am. She smiled. A small, genuine smile that made my heart ache in the best way. I reached for her hand and laced my fingers through hers. You know, we could leave, I said suddenly. Alice blinked, surprised. Leave? I nodded. Start fresh. Somewhere else. Just get out of here. She tilted her head, considering it. You serious? Dead serious. Alice's smile grew. I've waited my whole life to hear you say that. I laughed and pulled her closer. Then let's go. In that moment, I knew. I'd lost so much because of Lena, but I'd gained something I never expected. Real love, the kind that didn't play games or come with conditions. As the sun rose higher, I felt the weight of the past, finally. Lift, Lena had tried to destroy me, but in the end, she only set me free.